What's up? Thanks for checking out Jason Fager Racing on YouTube. I'm going to talk about a little front end stuff today. We're not going to get super depth, but a lot of things that people overlook. I was out helping my buddy set his valves on his Masterbuilt car the other night, a little bit older Masterbuilt. And I looked down at his right front and I'm like, man, we got some issues here, right? Just without even checking anything out. So I thought, I get this all the time. I'm not just picking on him. I get it all the time. It's very common. So I wanted to run through some stuff. Obviously, this is probably not more for your top level guys. They know what's going on, but like there's so many weekend warriors out there with older cars that just really, I don't know. Nobody's probably ever taught them. It's really not that complicated. I got some simple ways to do some things. So we're gonna go over that. If you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, like all our videos, and we're gonna get into this. So it's Saturday, we got rained out, and we're in the garage, drink a couple beers, working on some cars, trying to make everything a little bit faster. Been a pretty busy day. But like I said, I was out helping my buddy the other night, and I see this all the time, right? Like everybody, I help a lot of crate guys. I got a lot of friends that race, and I like to see people do good, right? And so there's a lot of little simple things that people overlook and don't understand that are very simple, and you really don't even need much money and tools or anything. A guy can do this with some straight edges and some tape measures and really make a lot of gains, I feel like, on a lot of people's cars. So, few things I feel like is a must. This intercom gauge is my favorite little gauge. Somewhere I got one out of the box. Where'd I put it? I don't know. Top of the car? Thanks, Zach. There it is. So, I thought it was in my pocket. This intercom gauge is like 65 bucks. Probably can find it cheaper. I know you can get cheaper ones. This intercom gauge though is probably worth the money. I mean, if you're gonna spend $25 on a cheap one, I'd rather see you get this one. It is backlit, so if you're under the car using it for 4-bar angles, you can read it. It is also more accurate. I think it's like to 1/10 of a degree, where a lot of the cheaper ones are like 3/10 of a degree. Not that it's make or break, but it definitely is nice. The other good thing about it is it's rechargeable just with a little, I think it's a C-type or USB type connector. So it's rechargeable, so that's always nice, not having to go find batteries or whatever. So I really like this intercom gauge. It's the only one intercom has. I know you can get them at Performance Bodies. Pretty much everybody that sells any kind of race car parts has these, but this gauge right here is it is definitely a $60, probably a must have. If you don't have it though, you got an iPhone. It has a, go under measuring. It has a angle finder right in it. It's actually surprisingly pretty accurate here. Go to your little measure app and then go to level. And right here, you know, you got an angle finder. So like, I mean, obviously it's not as accurate, right? But it's at least gonna get a guy in the ballpark. You know what I'm saying? I don't know much about Android phones. They probably have something. But you know, this is, if you had to, this is definitely something better than nothing, right? So, I really like these plates. A lot of guys have a bump steer gauge. Never use it. Pain in the butt. Complicated as heck, right? So a lot of times you can just take your plate right out of your bump steer set. You can use that. This one's a Wehrs Machines plate. I really like this. This is what I use for my bump steer. Another thing I do feel like is if you don't, these are a really good investment. Wehrs has them now where you can put them on the ground like the Hammond plates. But like now we set up pretty much all our caster, camber, toe. We set it all in the air now. We don't even mess with it on the ground, especially the toe. We always do it in the air. I feel like you get better, more accurate readings, way more consistent, and it's just way easier. I mean, nothing's worse than you got to put the car down on the ground, check the toe, set it, and then jack it back up, put it back on the stand, do some other stuff, right? If you guys don't have that stuff, I mean, obviously, like, I'll show you, I'll go through some of the stuff in a little bit, right? You can take you a straight edge. You can get you a bigger one and drill 2 holes in it, bolt it right to the ears. You can take up your caliper. You can clamp it right to your rotor. Like, there's a lot of things you can do with just a couple pieces of straight aluminum that'll help you through a lot of things. Another thing I love, these Outpace setup sticks are some of the nicer ones out there. I got a actuator I made in here right now. It makes it really easy for doing bump steer. But like this deal here is really simple, right? We have these for all 4 corners. I feel like, you know, every week we come home, we take off our shocks, we put these on the car. And you know, they're adjustable and they got different marks here, you know, you can adjust it. So these are really handy, but we have these for every corner. We use them religiously. We come in and take the shocks off, we put these on here. But like, you know, our right front on the Longhorn hangs at 16 and 18. So when we got those rods in there, you know, we can fold our plates on and check toe. You know, so it's just really simple. We do it every week. And it's like, you know, a lot of guys, I think, look past that stuff. We usually will check our toe before we maintenance, because that way, if it's their toe changed from the week before, obviously you got something bent. It's not just going to change without something bent. And so we do that, and then if it's right, then we maintenance the car, then we don't have to recheck it. So that's definitely critical, right? If you don't want to buy the sticks, you don't have sticks. It's real simple. Just get you a flat piece of aluminum. Whatever your center to center is, drill you 2 holes. Same thing for me. So like, if you want to check your bump, we got a hole here, and you can have your hole at center to center, and you can go 18, 16, 15, 14, right? So you can run it through your travel. I mean, everybody has scrap pieces of metal laying around. You can do this on all 4 corners. It really doesn't cost you much money. You can just stick it right in there. And then when you're going to check your bump, as long as you don't turn the hub, you know, you can start at 18, and then you can raise up and then move your bolt. Just don't turn your hub, and then, you know what I'm saying? It's just a really easy way to do it. So, another thing that I really like, I hate, goes back to that digital angle finder. I don't even use a bubble gauge anymore. Used them for a long time. I know a lot of people still do. I feel like there's a lot of inaccuracies with them. I've like tried 3 different gauges in a row, different ones, and they've all been different readings, right? And this guy has this rack, and you know, everybody's interpretation of 20 degrees is kind of harder to do. If you do have to use a bubble gauge, I recommend getting like an angle finder or drawing on a piece of paper, something like 20 degrees, just drawing you 2 straight lines, you know, like a 20 degree line, laying it on the ground kind of by the tire, put 1 spoke straight up and down, and turn the tire until it lines up. You can eyeball a lot better with that 20 degree line, and then see how far your spoke turned, right? So I run a 4.5 inch rack with these steering arms. Typically that's about 1 spoke. So we would go 1 spoke up and turn it 1 spoke. And then that's how you would know 20 degrees. So, and then it's not necessarily super important to do the 20 degrees, I don't feel like, all the time. It's just knowing that you repeat consistent ability throughout the process as you do it week to week or throughout the season. You don't want to turn it 30 degrees one time and 20 degrees the next time, or if you adjust something and you can really get a lot of variances doing it that way. So for me, if you're going to use a bubble gauge, I would definitely recommend trying to figure out a spot on the steering wheel, start strapping down to what point you need to turn it to, and just repeat it that way. It's also, once you do that, it's way simpler to keep doing that. Keep in mind, if you're going by your spokes though, cars are different, because you got some cars run a longer steering arm, some cars run a shorter steering arm. If you got a 4 inch rack, it's going to be different than a 4.5 inch rack, or a 4 1/4 or 3.75. So you definitely got to check your 20 degrees per rack, and don't always just think it's going to be the same on every, you know, I turn this car 1 spoke, it's going to be the same on the next car, it's going to be 1 spoke. So that does vary. So if you're going to do that, I'd recommend checking that method per what you have on the car for that time. But that being said, we don't use bubble gauges anymore. We use the angle finder. Obviously it's magnetic. We clamp it right on the rotor. That gives you your camber reading. I mean, live camber all the time. Dave Hammond has that deal, that Hammond set, little caster thing. It's really nice. I lost mine, so I loaned it out and nobody brought it back. So if you got it, bring it back. But it's real simple. All it is a weld-in slug basically into a chassis slug, you know. So like most all your late model stuff runs a 5/8 fine thread. I mean, just screw that right on there. Just cut you out a little piece of metal. This screws right on the, I'll show you. It screws right on the ball joint here. And now you're getting live caster reading. You clamp the gauge on there. Zach can probably get in here. See that? You're going to be getting live caster reading all the time, right? And as long as you got the gauge front to back the same on both sides, I mean, it's so much easier, so much more consistent. And to me, it's a really easy tool to make, and it's way more accurate. I don't like just sticking to the side of the spindle, because it's definitely not usually, most of your spindles aren't the same, right? Like that one there, this one's huge. This one's a 5 degree difference from the ball joint to that spindle, because it's just how the bodies are tapered on the spindle, how those spindles are made. So now some spindles might be okay, but most of them I've never found that are consistent or made to be done that way. So I definitely don't recommend doing that. Another good thing to do, a lot of your older cars, you know, if you're fortunate enough to have an XR1 or a Longhorn or a newer MB or something where your chassis manufacturer has figured out your center to centers, it makes your life a lot easier, right? We know this car is built around this platform. That's where it needs to be. Life's real simple. If you have an older car before, we were really into the spring smashing or really into that stuff and knew what we were doing more, it's a little bit harder, right? You can't just take some of these numbers and take it for granted. So you got to put the car down and scale it. You need to scale it old school. And then you need to set your ride heights. And then just like I would say, like your chassis manufacturer recommends, right? And then when you do that, you would come in, if it was me, if you do have a spring smasher, I would measure my spring collapse on there instead of trying to measure center to center of your eye, because your bolts can be crooked like this if your shock's a little angled. So I would always measure my spring collapse, and then I would take it out, I would go put it in my spring smasher, and then I would set it, I'd re-tape measure it, and then I would look at my spring smasher to get my number to my center to center. So you have your own smash numbers, right? Your own center to centers of what is for your car. If you don't have a spring smasher, just go center to center, or rough what you can, the best you can. But that's very important. And the other thing, when you're doing this, I feel like a lot of people mess up on it. You don't want to be scaling your cars with soft springs or stacks in the left rear or traction shocks, because of everybody's running soft right front stuff now, soft left rear stuff, because you can really manipulate the car, right? If you bounce it a little bit this way or pick it up or push it down, that little bit can really change a lot. So I would definitely recommend scaling like a minimum like a 400 right front spring, back the rebound out, no left rear front traction shock, probably at least a 225 to 250 rear. Me personally, when I do set a car down to set my front end and do all that stuff, I got 4 old oil shocks. I got all the oil drained out of them, and I got like 400-pound springs all the way around the car. So a little adjustment makes a lot, but basically we've taken all the spring equation out and all the shock equation out, right? It just settles the same every single time. So you can really manipulate the car a lot with the rebounds and the soft springs and stuff. So you definitely don't want to do that, because that can make you just keep chasing your tail and chasing your readings for a long time before you get what you like. So let's assume you have your center to center. Something that's important to me, I would always check my upper control arm angles, and I would check my lower control arm angles. It goes back to having your angle finder, right? Just throw this on here. It's good for notes, right? Like, I'm fortunate we have a Longhorn. I mean, for a while now, the XR1s, the Longhorns, your newer stuff, this stuff's pretty much figured out. We don't really have to mess with it. But a lot of the older guys, you just don't have good baselines. I mean, we didn't know what we were doing back then, and things have evolved a lot, right? Then it's nobody's fault. It's just how it is, and there's nothing wrong with that stuff. But you just got to work a little harder to figure it out. So that's where you need to angle finder your lower control arms, angle finder your upper control arms, and I would do that on the ground at ride height. I would say on your right front lower control arm, you probably want to be somewhere from 1 degree to 2 degrees uphill to the ball joint from the frame, maybe 3 degrees max. The left front can range, anywhere from like probably the same thing, but it's probably gonna be more like a 3 degree uphill, somewhere in there, 2 to 4 degree uphill to the ball joint. So even if you want to change your manufacturer's ride heights, you can get your new center to centers. If you go off your angle finder on your lower control arms, to me that's a lot more accurate than going off of like if the further inboard you go, like chassis to ground, it's a lot easier to go outboard, right? So I always tried to measure my shock center to center or an angle like that, right? The upper control arm angles, I mean, it varies. Obviously, if you're running a different length, you probably need a little more angle. If you're running a shorter A-arm, you probably need less angle. So there's definitely a big range there. I don't really know. I'd say probably somewhere from 15 to 20 degrees on the right front, and maybe 10 to 15 degrees on the left front is going to be a range. I know what our stuff is, but that it's not going to work because there's different spindle heights and a lot of different variables going on. But you at least need to halfway be in those range, right? And then something, obviously you don't want bent spindles, you don't want bent ball joints, you don't want bent upper control arms, you don't want bent lower control arms. I highly recommend, if you can, make some kind of a jig for your lower control arm and jig it off a new one, because nowadays if you're running the bump stops, a little bit of bend in that can be a lot when you're getting down into 4 to 5 inches of travel into that bump stop. A 16th to an 1/8 inch packer can make a huge difference. So if you have a little bit of bow in there, you can really be affecting your bottom numbers. So it's very critical to keep your lower control arms, definitely make sure they're not bent. I want to show you how I like to set bump steer. I kind of did this a while ago. I'm not saying this is the best way. Some people probably definitely want to agree with me, But listen, a lot of people don't ever check bump steer. They don't know how. Mess with a bump steer gauge is a pain in the butt. It's you barely touch the car. The gauges are going everywhere. And basically, what this is going to do the same exact thing, way simpler, way quicker. Everybody I show this to is like, oh my god, and I'm like, yeah, it's simple. Like, right? You can check it at the track. You can check it anywhere. It's so much easier. And like I said, you don't have to have this plate. You can do it with your straight edge. And if you don't know what bump steer is, you see us have a slotted rack where your tie rod is up or down, or you can shim out here. You can put bump steer spacers in between your tie rod and your spindle. This stuff's all pretty much just set to factory. Like I say, we're fortunate. Longhorn's done a great job. Their stuff's pretty much standard. You don't have any issues. If you put it where they tell you, it's going to be really, really close to being on the money, right? But I see so many cars that are so far off, it's not even funny. And you can add shim or take away shim. It's crazy how much you can affect it. Like, if we had this right now and we just slid that all the way up or all the way down on the rack, you just watch it go in or out, right? And especially when it's all the way up, it's just crazy how drastic that little bit of a change actually makes. So a lot of people never ever check this, right? And basically, so a bump is, you always want to bump out, you never want it to bump in. So bump is when the right front's traveling up, the tire starts to toe out, or that's what you're shooting for. So that's your bump steer, that's your bump out. And the left front is pretty much the same thing too, right? So as that thing goes up, the tie rod's traveling an arc. When anything traveling an arc, is going through a long point and a short point. So it's going to change. So that is something that's very critical, right? To at least know where you're at and know in your ballpark. And there's other ways to adjust that, So like basically nowadays, everybody knows how our cars are, right? We're running pretty much down all the time. You're down. Say your center to center is 18 inches. We're usually always at 15 inches or lower on the racetrack. It's never even up like at your static toe anymore. So you really need to know where this thing is at 3 inches and at 4 inches, right? And if you have a lot of bump out, well, then you just don't need as much static toe. Or if you have you don't have much bump out, maybe you need more static toe. So basically, I look at it as you're just affecting the overall toe when you're at that position going around racing the racetrack. And I see guys bump in, I see guys bump out. Maybe you set your car to 3/4 or 1 inch of toe out, and then you go bump, and it's nothing to make this thing bump out a whole nother inch. So now you're running around there at 2 inches of toe out, which is a lot, right? So it definitely is important to check your bump. A lot of guys don't know how to do it, and that's what I'm going to show you a really easy way. And like I say, you don't need this tool. You can do it with your straight edge clamps across here, but this is how I like to do it. And it doesn't matter that your frame rail is not straight in your car, if it is or isn't, because we're just going off a relative, right? And I know some people are going to disagree with me, but this is way better than not doing anything, right? So I'll come in here and I go to the frame rail. I just take a tape measure, I go to the frame rail, I come in here and I'll set it the same on both sides, right? So you just turn that just a little bit till you get that thing just the same. It'll take you a few times, especially if you haven't done it before. So we're pretty close. And say you have a frame, I don't think there's many cars that this frame rail is not pretty straight in a car, but if you have some with a lot of radical angle, you can say we're sitting here at 18 inches and this frame rail is kicking way out. Well, there's nothing wrong with saying this is 18 and a half and leaving the front at 18, because you can just do the math as you go up through travel. So I'm lucky I got this little actuator I built in here, but no, now I checked that, right? And so I got it dead straight. So I'm just gonna run this up, and you run this up wherever you want. I recommend going up and checking it at 3 inches, and I'm checking it at 4 inches, right? So we'll take this thing all the way up to 4 inches. And then I like doing this because it has the numbers. I can check it at 4 inches and I can measure, and then you just split the difference, right? So if the back now is a 1/4 inch smaller than the front, you got a 1/4 inch of bump out at 4 inches. It's really simple. And if you got to angle the tape measure, it really doesn't matter, because it's still going to gain or subtract the same amount. So it's still relative and you're still getting a good idea. And like, honestly guys, you can a lot of times just hold that thing at ride height and lift it up and watch it either go, if you're way off, it's either going to watch it go way out or way in. Like, you can usually visibly see it. But like I said, that's really simple. You can do it on the ground with a floor jack. You can use that deal like this. So there's really not a good excuse on not being able to do it. I mean, a tape measure and a straight edge, you can do it no problem, right? I just feel like a lot of people don't understand it and don't know what they're looking for, right? So what you're looking for bump out, like I said, it kind of varies on your toe and it's a driver preference, but you definitely want it to bump out. I would say you want probably anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch at 4 inches, somewhere in that neighborhood. But it also goes back to your static toe, like I'm saying. So, and every car is going to be different how that works. Another good general rule of thumb that a lot of people don't, I see a lot of people make this mistake. Set your right front tie rod length to a specific length. Don't ever change it, right? Unless you had to change it to get some more backsteer or something. A good rule of thumb is, say your right front lower control arm is 19 inches. Set your tie rod 7/8, at least 3/4 to 7/8 longer. So if your tie rod, say your lower control arm center is 19, set your tie rod to 19 3/4 or 19 7/8. Pick one and leave it there. Typically, your rack point, your inner rack point, and your lower heim of your lower control arm will be almost straight in line together if you look straight down at them. Usually they almost always line up, right? And sometimes, like I said, if you need a little bit more back steer because you got a slower rack or a long steering arm car, that could vary a little bit. But once you figure out where you want your right front tie rod, don't ever adjust it. Leave it set to a certain length all the time. Only set your toe with your left front, because when you adjust that tie rod length, you adjust your bump steer. So that is, I mean, it's just because it's a rod and it's an arc, it's traveling arc. So the longer or shorter the rod, the different of the length track of an arc it's going to take. So tie rod length definitely affects bump steer. So you have to have your toe roughly close. So that's kind of how you do your bump. I would recommend doing the left front too. Left front obviously is not near as critical. Most guys say to set the left front to 0. But a lot of guys will go down 1 inch and then up 1 inch. I typically like to bump out when I'm going into compression. So when it's going up, I like to see at least a little bit of bump out. Maybe a 16th or an 8th. Something, I mean, people play around with more or less, whatever. But definitely check it. Make sure you're not bumping in on compression. So that covers bump, right? But you definitely want your front end to be close before you set the bump. You would actually set your bump last, right? After your tie rod is set on the right front, after your toe set, and after everything, caster, camber, all that stuff is set. The other thing, I saw my buddy's car the other night, like his right front control arm was actually running downhill. You don't just think you need to make it go downhill toward the back either, right? A good rule of thumb is, like, especially with that digital camber gauge, you check your caster, right? Put the live caster reading on there. Put your car at ride height and see where it is, and just take this thing up to 3 inches or 4 inches of travel, and then recheck your caster. That's why it's really easy with that digital gauge, right? And I would say you don't want to lose caster, right? I don't know that you need to gain a whole bunch, but I mean, I would say you need to be from 0 to a degree of gain on the way up. If you're losing caster, in my opinion, that's bad. I'm sure some cars might lose camber or caster gain. I don't know. But I would, if you change your upper control arm angle like this, it's going to travel an arc backwards. So that's going to help you gain caster as it goes up. The same token, we all used to run shims. A lot of this stuff's really changed a lot from the new cars to older cars because we've gotten so much more down clearance. But we used to run the heims underneath way far forward on our strut, and we'd have a spacer and have it way down. Well, now we've raised that up to keep it out of the dirt, but when you do that, you angle that control arm. So now your lower control arm is traveling backwards out of arc. So maybe it's traveling more backwards now than it used to. So maybe you got to put more angle in your top control arm to keep your caster gain the same. But like I said, guys, this is stuff that you can really check pretty simple without much money and tools. I feel like it'd be a huge advantage. I just see it time and time again, right? Another thing that we would do is obviously we would take the other Wehrs plates. We'll just change that real quick. All right, so I've switched plates. This is how we would set toe. We would just run our tape measure. We'd have a plate of this on each side. We'd run it across, and that's how we'd set our toe, just like you do with a toe sticker towing. But as long as you got your ride height here, and that's your ride height, that's how we set our toe. And it's just a lot more about the repeatability too. And then knowing your final when everything's up where you're at while you're racing, going around a racetrack. If you don't have these plates, you can still do it with your tires on the car. right? Just put a tire on there as long as you have your sticks in there. Same thing, you could even check the bump with a tire on the car if you don't want to use a straight edge or something, right? So like, it's definitely very doable. And I think it'll make your life a lot simpler to do things this way. Where was I going next? Covered a lot. Oh, another thing, Ackermann steering. So people get confused by Ackermann. Ackermann is basically when you start to turn the wheels, they turn it, your left front tie rod is usually a lot shorter than your right front tie rod, right? 3 inches shorter. Steering arms will be different lengths. So when you turn those tires, your right front might turn faster than the left front. So say we're sitting here at 1 inch of toe out straight ahead. Well, as you start to turn, say you turn one spoke to the right, well, you possibly could be now 1.25 inches of toe out, or you possibly could be at 3/4 of an inch of toe out. That's your Ackermann, is how it changes as you're turning through your motion. And that's because of tie rod length and steering arm length is the main factors and the easiest ones to correct. So same thing, if you had these plates, you could just hold them on both sides and you could turn the wheels and then you could check your Ackermann. You could do it with tires in a car. You could do it with straight edges. Obviously with straight edges, if you're clamped to the rotors or whatever, it'd be a whole lot easier without your motor and your radiator in there because you could run a straight tape measures straight through the frame. Ackermann can be hard to fix. Once again, I don't know that it's a necessary fix. It's just more about knowing where your total toe is. So I would also recommend try to have a good idea of how far you turn your hands. Like typically me, I'm like one spoke or one spoke. So that way when you're doing this stuff, well, there's no sense in turning it, this far to the left because we never even get there, right? Or that far to the right because most of the time you're not there unless you get really crossed up or something. But typically, you're less than one spoke each direction. Maybe one spoke to the right and a half a spoke to the left. So try to pay attention to where you're at because then there's no sense in worrying about your Ackermann. I've done this before, right? I'll turn, I'm like, oh man, I'm way turned here and my Ackermann is crazy. Well, I'm worried about, well, in reality, you're never really there on the racetrack. Another thing you do is if you got a GoPro, you can watch your hands, right? Go back and rewatch the race. You can tell a lot by seeing where your hands are at on the steering wheel and how far you're actually turning. So like I say, you'd pull your tape measure across, you can see where that's at. And that just goes back to like, if you feel like, most of the time you're half a spoke or spoke to the right and you've lost toe, well, maybe you just need to add 1/4 inch more toe, right? Of static toe to compensate for that. Or same toe, if you're gaining a bunch of toe, maybe you just need to back a little bit out of there to keep it a little more true. But it's just stuff that you need to know to make you better. If you do want to change your Ackermann, obviously tie rod length affects the Ackermann, or your steering arm front to back affects Ackermann. So a lot of times that's hard for people to change. Another thing which was very common on your older cars is your tie rod from your spindle to your rack actually is pretty much dead straight, which isn't good. You want your tie rod running ahead to your spindles because the path of the arc. Otherwise, what happens is when you turn back, you see we turn back and we're pretty much on full lock and my tie rod's still pretty much dead straight in the car. Well, what happens if you started straight, now this tie rod's sitting here way angled backwards, right? So now you're working both sides of this arc, which typically isn't a good thing. We start with more angle, so when we back steer, we're only working on the one side of the arc. That's more your newer stuff. I see that it's really common in a lot of older cars. Once again, it's just because we have advanced a lot. We know way more now than we did. So that's just why I'm saying on some of that older stuff, it's probably important to check that Ackermann. Some of the cars, it's not hard to drill some extra holes and back your rack up. Doesn't cost any money, it's just a little bit of work. But it's just more important in my mind just to know your total toe when your right front's down to your 3 inch mark, 4 inch mark, somewhere in there, right? Get an idea where your total toe is, and it's easier to adjust the toe and compensate for that. Something else I forgot to say, when you are checking your bump steer, your caster automatically affects bump steer. So if you have more caster, your spindle leans back, it raises your steering arm up. So the more caster you have, obviously the more shim you're gonna need, or the more it's changing your bump steer. So that's where, if you change the spindle or if you add caster, take caster out, you need to go back and reset your bump steer. Don't just think, oh, I set my bump steer once, it's gonna be the same all the time, because it's not gonna be if you change other things. So I definitely recommend, like I said, setting your caster camber, and I would set my toe first, and then I would set my bump. And if for some reason my bump's dramatically off, I would get it close, and then I would reset my toe. You know, I have to do it 2 or 3 times. I like to do it that way, just to make sure I stay right. Like I say, I see this time and time again, guys, and it's frustrating for me because, let's face it, it's very expensive to go to the racetrack. I don't care what you have or what class you're in. We all spend a lot of money in fuel. We all spend a lot of money in pit passes, and there's no sense in not, I tell everybody, there's no sense in being not prepared when you go to the racetrack or trying to lose more money than possible, right? So a lot of this stuff, like I said, you don't really need these fancy tools. You can do it with your cell phone, tape measures and straight edges and some scrap metal. So a lot of this stuff is just about the work. I just feel like people don't really know what they're doing. That's a lot of the reason why I wanted to put this out there. Another really common problem I see, I'll go grab some in a minute, but I get this all the time too. Like, people are like, man, I feel like I'm bottoming out. I feel like I'm bottoming out. Well, they're not bottoming out. You see this a lot. They're dead solid in the right front, right? I'll go grab a couple springs here in a second, but like, if you're running an old school spring, it can't travel 4 inches. If it travels 4 inches, it's coil bound. Or a lot of shocks, you got to make sure you have enough down travel. I see it a lot. My buddy the other day, he had the older Integra, great shock, but it has the real big adjuster eye on it, right? And the eye is so big, you're losing a lot of compression travel. I know the Genesis was pretty bad for that. The crate guys that can't run canisters, that's even more critical because the base valve goes into the shock, so they get less down travel yet than a canister shock typically. So it's pretty critical to make sure you have, I just see it common, I guess, is what happens is most people say, oh, they put this Christmas tree bump, everybody's running this Christmas tree bump stop like a Penske Blue or whatever, right? So they put it in there. Well, that's great, but we can get 5 inches of down travel or 5.5 inches of down travel. Well, these guys, you put that bump stop on there, and even with no spring, it might be solid at 3 3/4 inches because it's in the bump so hard, just because there's not as much down travel in that shock. So it's really critical. If pretty much everybody has somebody with a spring smasher or a buddy that has something, right? So know your center, take it over there, let them check it out. A lot of it you can just do with math or numbers and just some common sense too, you know? Like, typically you probably need to be at least 17 3/4 to 18 1/4 center to center. Like 18 is a pretty common number nowadays, or more. That way we get more down travel. But if you're flirting around that 17 3/4 or less on a center to center, you probably definitely don't have enough down travel, especially if you're on a non-canister crate shock, right? No matter what shock it is. So maybe if that is your best case scenario, maybe that's why you feel better on a stiffer spring, is because you're not coil binding the spring, or you're not getting into that bump stop and getting it as solid. So it might not, it's like the lesser of two evils, but that doesn't mean you're going faster. Or maybe it's just a case you just need to really back off the bump stop. Just put like a 1 inch roller skate in there or something, just to help it at the bottom, so it comes in later. It's a hard balance to do. The best case scenario, which is hard, especially if you didn't have a spring smasher, but if you had to run a shock like that with small travel, you're probably gonna be better off on a stack, because you can build up a lot more rate with a spring at the bottom than you are with a progressive bump stop. So that's a little bit more forgiving in that aspect, but a stack's also harder to tune, in my opinion, especially for guys that don't really know what they're doing. But definitely make sure you get enough down travel and you're not spiking that thing solid. We'll go grab a couple springs and show you guys some differences on some springs on that. All right, guys, I grabbed a couple springs, and I see this a lot, right? So this is like, I'd call an old school spring. This is an old Hypercoil 400 spring. This is what we ran when I started racing. This is a new Hypercoil 400 pound spring, same 10-inch spring, but you can see the difference in coils, right? Both are 400 pound 10-inch springs. This spring will coil bind 100% of the time if you have this on the right front, right? Because it's close coil. It just doesn't have as much compression. That's why all your newer springs are like this. And technically this newer Hypercoil is a barrel spring. It's just not a large barrel spring. So the new Hypercoils, if they're ground on both ends, that would be a good spring. The new ones aren't that way. The new ones that have the writing on the side, like kind of laser etched on there on the side, though it's the same spring, it's just a different way of labeling it. The older Hypercoil springs are only ground on one end and not the other end. So you have any of those, that is a pretty old spring, and it would more than likely always coil bound on the right front. Your old school Carreras, AFCOs, a lot of that stuff, If they look like they're that close together, like you're barely getting one finger in there, guys, it's going to coil bind on you. Left front, you're probably getting okay. The other corners, you probably need to worry, right? Like you can see there's a huge difference here, right? Obviously, the newer stuff, right? Here's a new Swift. I mean, I know it's a lighter, it's 250, so it's a smaller diameter wire, but like you can see how much farther. Like I can almost get pretty much getting 2 fingers in there, right? And then this would be a 375 hypercoil barrel, but this would be like a UHT hypercoil, they call it. The nicer thing about these is it's not super critical in a standard spring, but when you start getting into the lighter springs and you really start compressing them a bunch, the barrels just stay a little, they don't get the bow in them, right? They just stay a little bit more straight. But like I said, these hypercoils will be fine. A lot of your Integra has a nice spring. A lot of them are fine. You just got to stay away from the stuff that has the super close coils because it's definitely going to coil bind on you, right? Well, all right, guys. I sure hope that helps a lot of you guys out. Like I say, I help a lot of my buddies. There's a lot of guys out there trying to make the best they can with older race cars out there. They just have a lot of mechanical flaws because we didn't know what we were doing back in the day, right? So I really hope this video helps. I try to show you some cheap ways with some stuff you got laying around the house that you could probably make dramatic improvements to your race car. We'll do our best we can to get back to all the questions. Obviously, I don't have all the answers, especially when you're talking old cars and different solutions, you know, or different brands and stuff like that, right? So, but a lot of that stuff, you know, is pretty universal, chassis manufacturer, across the board. So you should be able to visibly see a lot of issues there. Give you a lot of information to look for. Really appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully we can do some more stuff like this. We really want to. It's just finding the time to do it, but I love helping people out. We can't divulge too much top secret information, obviously, right? But there's just lots of little things. It's just a lot of legwork, guys, and just but you know, if you're doing this on a budget and you got an older car, I know you're not scared of hard work. So just get out there and do it and do the best you can. Like I say, we'll do the best we can to respond to any questions, and hopefully it's helps you guys you know, enjoy your racing experience and do better when you get to the racetrack and fixes some of your problems. So once again, appreciate everybody tuning in and checking out the channel, and have a good rest of your Saturday night.